All right, hi, welcome to this tutorial. My name is Alex Senechal, and I work for the film and games industry, designing various different things, mostly hard surface. And today in this tutorial, we're going to be talking about getting into Keyshot, all the basics you need to know for Keyshot 9, going from lighting, rendering, different ways to use cameras, the geometry view, materials, everything you need to know to get started in this program. So we're going to be making this render that you see today. You know, I have a model. You can use any model that you want to follow along. It doesn't matter. Just make sure it has multiple parts and you'll be fine. All right, so let's just go ahead. You know, like a typical program, we have all these options up here and we go to the File menu and we're going to hit New. Let's start over from scratch and we can go to Import. And I'm just going to import this file here. So one cool thing about Keyshot is that Keyshot can take your OBJs, and also it can take your IEGSs or your other types of formats of CAD files and convert them directly into poly, so you can use them right here in Keyshot instantly. So we're using Keyshot 9. And one of the things that's new in Keyshot 9 is the ability to use GPU to render, and that's also sped up by the fact that we have RTX. You know, RTX, if you don't know, is basically enabling you to quickly ray trace on the GPU. And so that's one of the new features that Keyshot 9 takes advantage of. And so, you know, GPU rendering is generally, for most situations, significantly faster than CPU rendering. So we're going to be switching that on first thing. So we got our model. Let's go up here to GPU and let's just turn that on, and it's going to instantly speed everything up. All right, cool. So we're in GPU mode here. We got our object and you can just click and rotate around it. No problem. Let's just quickly talk about a few of the panels that you need to use Keyshot, and then we'll get into rendering this and setting everything up. So we've got two basic tabs. We have the the library tab, which is here. You can toggle it on and off here. And we have the projects tab. And so projects handles all of the things that are in the scene, from lighting to materials to objects to render settings, some of them, your cameras, and your post-processing. So we also have on the on the library side, we have our material libraries, you know, our colors, textures, environments, backplates, favorites, and models. Cool. So that's basic information, and we'll get into each of these as the tutorial progresses. So last thing before we move on, we have the render tab down here, and also access it from up here. And so this will allow us to set up our renders however we want them. So we'll talk about that later. All right, cool. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is we need to start assigning materials to our object. So let's just go to our Keyshot defaults. Now, mine is set up a little bit different than a default Keyshot, but typically you'll just see Keyshot defaults listed in the materials, and it'll look like these ones here. So let's just go to metal. Mine's not in the list, but let's just go to metal, and let's drag an aluminum texture onto our model. And so all you have to do is click and drag. It's that simple. And it'll assign to everything that already has the same materials. So if we go to the materials tab, you'll see we have 4 basic materials in our scene. These were assigned by our OBJ, and all of these are linked, all of these objects. So all of these objects with blue are sharing the same material. So if I drag this blue aluminum onto the blue objects, let's give it a second, you'll see that they all now have this material. So they're all being, the materials being shared between the objects when you click and drag. So let's just try and find a different blue, maybe a more shiny one. We're going to edit all of these later, so it's not a problem at all. All right, we've got these panels here. Now, if we go back to our Scene tab, we're able to click and hold Control, and it allows us to select objects in which we would like to assign a material. So the next way to assign a material, let's go to our plastics, and let's just go down to a hard, dark plastic. We can click and drag it directly into this view here. And so now these objects have the black material. Awesome. So the next thing I'd like to do is, I'm not a fan of this white background. I don't want to use this HDRI either. We're going to set up our own HDRI and our own lighting environment. So let's just go over here to the Environments tab, and let's just, we can change a lot of things about our HDRIs here, but let's just turn that off. So we're going to go to HDRI settings here, and let's just hit color, and this makes the background in the HDRI editor this specific color rather than using an image. So I've decided to make it black. Awesome. Now let's add a light pin to our HDRI. The HDRI editor is one of the best features in Keyshot, and this is because it allows us to make custom lighting super fast. So just hit a new light, very simple. This is the first way that we're going to be lighting our scene, and the first tool we're going to be using. The ability to place lights is so simple, but like let's say you want to hit a specific part, you want to get a highlight on a very specific area. Well, Keyshot has a great tool here called Set Highlight. You can see it right here, and we can use this to set a highlight exactly where we click based on the normals of the object. So for example, we can place a light, let's say we want a rim light. Let's get a nice rim light, find something that's a bit high contrast, a bit interesting, and hitting the object in just the right places. More of a glancing angle. It's not really a rim light, but I like it. And I'm just going to go down here and turn up the brightness a bit. And I'm going to adjust the fall off so it's a bit softer. You can see it's getting softer here. And I'm going to change that blend mode to quadratic because I found that it gets a more natural result. Personally, I'm not exactly sure why. I'm not a genius, but. And let's just move it around a bit. Just see if we can't get something slightly better. Eventually you get a feeling for where all of these lights are hitting based on their position in the HDRI editor. Yeah, I like this one because we're getting a lot of nice edge highlights. Awesome. So let's go down here, hit done. Or we can also turn on and off this click and drag, because if you forget to turn it off, you're going to accidentally start clicking on your scene and dragging the lights everywhere. So that's not something that we want. Awesome. So we figured out how to set up a light. That's the first way to light. All right. There's more ways to light, but we'll talk about them in a second. First, I want to introduce you to something that maybe a lot of people don't know who are getting into Keyshot or have been using it for a while. If we go over here to the Edit tab, we can add a ground plane. So let's add a ground plane. We can also add other simple objects to our scene, which are going to be very useful later when we set up our physical lighting. Awesome. So you may not see it now, but if we collapse this, you can see we have added a ground plane. I'm just going to zoom out and you can see this is the ground plane. It's quite large. And it's just a plane, and now it needs a material. So let's just go ahead and put a very reflective metal, like a chrome on it. Let's just take this chrome and place it on. Awesome. So now you can see we have a chrome floor. It's very reflective, looks cool. But let's blur it a little bit. So we can double click on an object to bring up its material properties automatically. So you can see if I double click on the floor, it's going to bring up the materials for the floor in the materials tab. So let's just increase the roughness, which is going to make the reflection a bit blurrier and give us a nicer result overall. So it's looking cool. All right, now that we've gotten into the material tab, I think it's time that we quickly set up a lighting setup using physical lights, and I'm going to introduce you to spotlights and how those work. And then we're going to go ahead and get started on refining the materials on this object. So something that you need to understand when you're using Keyshot is that lights don't work the same way they do in most programs. You can't just go and say, oh, create a light here. It doesn't work like that. Actually, it's a bit odd, but Keyshot uses a material to create lighting. And so you need an object to apply that material to. Now there's multiple ways to do it, and I'll show you them. But the one that I think I've been using the most recently is the spotlight. So let's just go ahead, create a cube. To be honest, it doesn't matter what shape you make at all. So you can see we put a cube in our viewport. Now let's go to this cube and let's just scale it down a lot because it doesn't actually matter what the size is. So we can move this cube around using these tools here, but we don't need to right now. So let's just hit OK. And let's go down to lights in the materials tab. And you can see up here we have area lights, which will basically apply a light to the whole object, like so. But we can also go down to here and we can do a point light. And you'll see a point light actually creates a specific object. You know, it's no longer using the cube to broadcast light, so to speak. It's actually making a light object. But the one that we're going to be using today is the spotlight. So let's just take a spotlight and drag it onto this cube. Awesome. Now let's double click on this cube here and go into our light settings, which is in the materials tab, of course. And let's just increase the radius of this. And let's increase the power. And then let's move it around and see if we can get our lighting to look a little bit better. And let's just make this a little bit bigger. Let's give it like a 50 scale. Now, one thing that I need to talk about before we get too far into this lighting is now that we've created the light, we understand the basic idea behind lighting in Keyshot, but we need to learn how to move them, how to make it work with our cameras, and also we need to figure out exactly how to move them from a specific camera angle. So I'm going to show you a few cool features a lot of you might not know about, even if you've been using Keyshot for a while. So let's go over to the camera tab. And let's just quickly look over the settings and set up our first camera. So, all right, you can see here we have free camera selected. This camera is unlockable, it's uneditable. I mean, you can edit the settings, but you can't keep them permanently. So what we need to do is we need to create a new camera. So let's find our angle. I like this angle. And I'm going to go up here and I'm going to hit Add New Camera. We're going to call this Main Shot 1. Awesome. So we got main shot 1 here. But let's say that we want to not have it move at all. We can go here and hit this lock button and then hit save. And so now the camera is not going to move. So we can freely go back to our main camera and move it around and then go back here and it never moves. But what if you want to move the light while you're alighting the object? Or sorry, what if you want to stay in this camera angle and light the object? That's something that I actually find is one of the great advantages of Keyshot over programs like Octane, where I find this workflow to be very frustrating. You know, because you have to change cameras to move lights, and it's I think it's very bad workflow. So one of the great things that Keyshot has is this feature here called the geometry view. So if you just press O on your keyboard, it's instantly going to bring up that geometry view. You can also go to it from the Windows tool and hit Geometry View. So here we can just zoom out. We can select our objects in the scene editor and then hit this button here. And now we can move our objects while staying in the view. So it's perfect for lighting your scenes when you can't directly see your lights in the viewport. So just pull this light out. And we can switch it to global so it's no longer following that local pivot. And let's just find the highlights that are going to give us the best look overall. I want to make it a little bit bigger. So I'm going to make my object size 70 in the object properties, maybe even 150. Because then we can just get that big soft light. I'm going to make it 250. And I'm going to turn down the power of the light because it's a bit too bright. And I want it to hit at a glancing angle so we can get a nice key light going on. It's going to give us a strong brightness. Let's just make it really bright. Okay. So we need to change the roughness on our aluminum just a bit, and it's going to change everything. So I made it 0.3. And one other thing we need to talk about before we get too far. So, all right, we got a bright light, but the problem is Keyshot has two different ways of rendering, and a lot of people don't know this and don't necessarily use it, but there's product mode, which is very good for product rendering, but it's not as natural how light bounces and all of these things. So I find that interior mode is going to give you a much more natural result with like how shadows resolve, how your lighting is working on an indoor setting. The bouncing is better, and it also has a different feeling to it versus the product mode. So both have different uses, but in this case, I prefer to use product mode. The only difference you're going to come across is that using custom control, you can only do in product mode. In interior mode, you're limited to max samples and max time, which is fine. So we're just going to use interior mode. And let's go back to setting up this light and getting a nice position for it. All right, so it's looking good. Want a nice gradient from one side to the other. I think I'm going to just turn down the brightness like 6,000, 3,000. And I'm just going to keep the fall off at 0.5. All right, cool. So let's close this geometry view for now. And let's just quickly go back to our environment tab and let's add one more light so we can get this looking how we want. But first I'm going to turn down this roughness. So I want it to be a bit more shiny. And we're just going to move this around until we get a look that we want. We want to fill in some of this dark areas here, but I don't want it to be too harsh. And so a quick trick is to just make your radius low, make your brightness high like an 8, make your radius like a 9, and then have a little bit of fall off. And we can make it actually a rectangle. So there's two types of lights in the HDRI editor. We have rectangular and circular. And we're going to do rectangular. And let's just go to size and make the X size very small. And make the Y size very tall. Make it very, very, very thin. And I'm going to rotate it. And it's going to give us some really interesting highlights. And it's going to hit the model at different ways than a typical light would. And so we can use this to get some more interesting results. And you can see it's hitting also our background in an interesting way. So we can make that just a little bit darker. And we can also duplicate it by right-clicking duplicate. And we can reuse this light again. And let's just use the set highlight and see if we can't get a few nice highlights going on. Awesome. I'm going to go back to my geometry view. Move this light a little bit more. And so you can see it's just a pretty iterative process, but you know, in practice, once you've done this enough, once you have like a material library set up, you know, I can bust out a render for a client in maybe like 5 renders in 20 minutes or more. You know, so this is one of the things that makes Keyshot such a powerful tool, is that you can quickly spit out good images. And you know, it doesn't mean necessarily that it's the best renderer out there, but it's fast, the workflow is quick, and with RTX, you know, you can do some really awesome stuff super fast. I use it a lot for my client work. All right, cool. So let's just turn this down a little bit. It's a bit bright. And let's go back to our environment tab and let's just move this one light here just a bit. Turn up that brightness. All right, cool. So I think the next thing that we need to do is get started on materials. I think that that's where we're really going to get stuff looking nice, because right now it's looking pretty bad, and that's just because we have bad materials. So I'm going to drag just a basic aluminum on here for now. Replace what's existing, and we're going to start assigning textures, and we're going to talk about how to do that very quickly. All right, cool. So let's go to our materials tab by double clicking on this aluminum, and let's put in a roughness map. So the roughness map. All right, so if we go here, we can click on our roughness material. And I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the materials tab. So we have three basic tabs. We have labels, which are for adding decals, which we'll talk about. We have textures, which are for adding textures, clearly. But there's only three outputs here, and some materials have different ones. But we also can click here, right click, add textures. We can add curvature, granite, leather, marble, all of these procedurals, animation, color, utilities, all of this. But let's just double click, let's just click it, and we're going to add a roughness map. So I have here some Quixel materials. You know, if you go to Quixel.com and you have an Epic account, you can download all of these Quixel materials for almost for free, and they're some of the most realistic materials you can get. All right, cool. So we've got a roughness map on our object now, and you can see it has changed the roughness of the object clearly. Now let's say we want to preview the material just on a small part quickly. So let's go to our render tab, and we're going to do something called region rendering. We're going to hit this region tab here, and you can see it brings up this box that we can now scale and place it. And it's going to focus all of that ray tracing, all of that GPU power on the specific spot, allowing you to see a quick result. So let's try a different one and see if we can get one that's maybe a bit more drastic, you know, with a bit more textural detail. So it's a bit difficult to see the textures right now. So let's change the scale. And you can just change the width here. I'm going to make it a bit larger and try a different texture here. All right, cool. Let's go here and make this 3000. See how that looks? All right, so I can see a little bit more textural detail here. And what I want to do is click this sync button, because what this sync button does is it makes every single texture have the exact same settings as far as scale. But like, let's say you're using, you know, a 4K texture and an 8K. Well, those two shouldn't scale at the same time, because a 4K should be a different size than an 8K due to the resolution, right? Those two aren't going to line up. So I just want to turn off sync here for that. And let's say we want to edit it. So one cool thing in Keyshot is we can actually play with values very easily. So we've got contrast slider here. And with the contrast slider, we can change the strength of this texture. We can change the brightness and the darkness as well as the contrast. So if we want to make it maybe, say for example, more rough, we can increase the brightness. If we want to decrease it, we can make it darker. So actually in this case, I want to decrease it just a little bit. And you can see we have a low res texture here. So I'm just going to scale this down some more. And you can see we're starting to get a bit more definition in our texture. Awesome. So one last thing that you can do is you can blend with a color, and I'll show you that in a diffuse later. All right, we also have the ability to anodize a metal and make it darker, or maybe make it, you know, colored. But in this case, I'm going to use the anodization by making the refractive index 1.8, and you know, based on the film extinction coefficient, you can control the brightness of the metal. And in this case, I want to leave it about here. All right, so let's see. The roughness is maybe still a bit too rough, so let's just brighten it a little bit. You know, you can tell by the highlights and how dark some of the darkest parts get. We want to find a nice balance where we're getting nice light. It's not fully, you know, bright. We get some nice contrast, you know, some dark areas, but we don't want it to be super shiny. Look. All right, cool. So that's the first thing that we need to do. Let's quickly talk about labels. So labels are the ability to add textures to your models and, or sorry, you can add stickers to your model. So I go over here to this labels tab, I hit plus, and I'm going to go to my personal sticker library. Now you can see I have an object now has been assigned to this place where I clicked, and we can just move this and edit it. So if we turn on translate, we can move this object around. But better yet, it only stays on the materials that it has been assigned to. Now something else that's cool is if you click, it'll just go to that point. No matter what angle it's at, it'll align itself to the normals of where you clicked. So I'm just going to turn off this DPI size for scaling, and I'm going to turn down the scale of this model, or of this label, and I'm going to move it right here. Awesome. So we have it exactly where we want it. We can just go back and add a lighter too, because it's getting a bit dark. Just to get this hitting at a nice angle. Awesome. Cool. And let's just adjust these a little bit so we're getting some nicer angles where the light's hitting. So once you get your materials much more refined, you need to redo your lighting pass oftentimes, or like get it a bit further, so that way the materials and the lighting are working together nicely. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and let's add some diffuse. So we can double click on this here, and it brings up the properties tab here. So if we go here to diffuse, we can now go and navigate to texture. So I'm going to go to my texture library, and I'm going to pick just a random texture. So you can see now if we turn on the region rendering, you can see that we have a lot of diffuse information here. But what I would like to do is darken this or color it. So I can hit this button here, blend with color, and it allows me to mix in a color with this texture. So I just want to darken it a bit. So I can either do it this way, or I can change the brightness slider. Now if I change the brightness slider, it's not going to be multiplying an extra color, which I think is probably beneficial. And I'm going to turn up the contrast just to help it become a bit stronger. Awesome. Cool. So turn off that sync again. And yeah, so that's how we're going to get some diffuse information going on here. Turn off this region rendering again. All right, so I would say that what we need to go over next is we need to talk about how to use the image editing and setting up our first render. And that's really going to be, covering a majority of the things that you need to do in this program. We covered setting up subtle materials. We also need to cover how to work with assigning materials one more way. And then I think we can call this good. So before we get into that, let's go here, double click on our metal, and let's make a new label. So I went new label, add texture. Let's go to our decal sheets, however you have yours set up, and let's just add one more texture. And I'm going to add, let's just add this, this prototype sticker. Why not? Looks cool. Hit move over here, move texture, turn off use DPI for size, and click. And our texture is going to be pasted exactly where we click. We can move it to get the exact place. Turn down the size and hit OK. Awesome. So now we got our next texture. It's only going to work there. All right. One thing that we need to do before we get into finalizing and rendering is we need to talk about copying materials and instances. So typically, you can instance materials, which means they share the same information, or you can make them new when you copy them. So if we click on an object and we right click and we can go up here to copy material, we can now control click the objects we want to assign this material to. So we got these ones here, and we have two options when we right click on them: paste and paste linked material. Now, paste linked material means these options, these settings from the material that we are copying from are going to be shared. So it's going to become linked with the material we're copying. But if you hit paste material, it won't be linked. So let's just go ahead here, right click and hit paste linked material. Awesome. So now our materials are now linked to this main material that we were using here. And yeah, it's looking exactly how we want, and they'll all update in real time. So you can see if we go here to diffuse, blend with color, and make it red, it's going to be red here as well, or blue. So now we can easily work on all of our materials at once. All right, so let's just quickly move this light around. I want it to look a little bit better. So the lighting is looking not so cool just yet. Just make it a little bit cooler, get this highlight looking nice, get a nice focal point. Awesome. Press O to close that again. And let's just add one more small light. I'm going to make it actually pretty big, pretty soft, and pretty subtle. It'll just fill in a lot of the places where everything is completely black. And we just want to make it a few points above that blackness. It's going to be a very subtle effect, but it'll be a nice way to fill in stuff so we don't have any places that are fully bright or fully dark, which is very important. All right, cool. So we talked about this tab, we talked about these tabs, but now let's talk about images. So the images tab, we have basic and photographic for how we do post-processing basically. And I'm going to set mine to linear so we can use the linear workflow. I'm not going to go over that in this video, but I suggest it. And let's just do our first render, and we'll talk about these settings when we're in the render view. So let's go to render. I'm going to do a 1080p render, and I'm going to set it for 2,000 samples just because, you know, maybe I don't need that many, but maybe I do. You know, maybe I let the render sit and it goes there while I'm away, but it'll probably only take a few minutes to render this. So I'm going to quickly talk about these before we hit render. So first we got layers and passes. You know, if you're familiar with rendering, we have our typical passes. We got diffuse, lighting, global illumination, etc., clown. And these are all going to separate basically these parts of a completed image, like what we're seeing on screen, and separate them into their individual parts. It's pretty simple. We have the ability to output here, and we can choose from many different file formats like PNG, JPEG, EXR, TIFF, PSD, etc. Let's just use PNG with alpha for this render, and we're going to name it Cool Render 100,010. And we can see we have GPU settings set to 100% usage. And let's just hit render. All right, so this is rendering. I'm going to pause the video while this renders, and then we're going to talk about these image settings and wrap it up. All right, so you can see our render only took 2 minutes, minute 53, and we've got this completed image. So let's talk about these simple settings. So we've got here on this side, you can see in the render view, we've got curve, which is pretty much like any photo editing program. It lets you adjust the values of specific value ranges. And so we don't need that just right now. So let's just turn this off. We got color, so we can turn up our vibrance and our saturation. Let's just turn it up a bit. And we have denoise. So denoise is going to be using, I believe, AI algorithms in order to see noise, find the patterns, and to break them up. Typically, I don't use denoise, and in this image, we have almost no noise. And so it's very even difficult for me to see the difference, but I can see it specifically here and here. But in this case, yeah, I don't really need to use it right now. But yeah, so if you have a lot of noise though in an image and you need to get something fast, try out this denoise setting. It's new. And we also have here bloom. Now, bloom is one of the areas where Keyshot really falls flat. But in this case, you can still use it to make it break up that Keyshot feel. You know, if you're used to Redshift or Octane, you're going to find that, you know, the bloom in Keyshot is nothing near what those guys offer. Sadly. But we can still use bloom in Keyshot to give it a nice feeling, make it feel a bit more soft than you'd typically expect in Keyshot. And so if we turn up that intensity, dial down that threshold, meaning the brightness that is required to generate bloom, and then we dial up that radius, we can still make a soft effect, and it'll make it feel a bit more less rough, less harsh, which is something Keyshot is known for. You can typically spot a Keyshot render versus an Octane render if you've been rendering long enough. So we also have vignetting, you know, just like any other program. Dark shadows around the edge, you can change the color. Pretty straightforward setting. And then we also have here, we have chromatic aberration. So chromatic aberration is typically in photography something very bad because it's a lens distortion that occurs when you have cheap lenses generally. On all lenses, but cheaper lenses have it worse. But in CG, we actually like it because it can make it feel a bit more authentic and add a nice layer of subtlety. So Keyshot actually is a very nice setting for it. Now, in the past, I've typically applied my chromatic aberration in Photoshop, but it's difficult if you're compositing many different slides. So using it in Keyshot can actually make it a much more preferential use case than, say, doing it in Photoshop if you're compositing multiple render layers. All right, cool. So the last thing we need to do is just hit save, and we can pick, you know, what we want to save this as. So we can just call this. It automatically saves, by the way, but in this case, I can pick a specific name and save it, like, let's say, halfway through the process of creating the render. So we can just name it QRQRWQR, hit save, and we're good to go. In this case, you know, we don't need to do that. Let's just hit close. We're done. The render has been saved to our render folder. Yes, I would like to save my changes. We name it 353. And so now we have a finished render. We went through the whole process. You know, we talked about doing all of the things, covering rendering, covering materials, covering lighting, importing objects, and working with cameras. So hopefully now you have a good understanding of how to get into Keyshot. It's very simple, it's very fast, and with RTX it's even faster. You know, I hope you guys like this video. Stay tuned to the channel for more, and thanks for watching.